So I just started that recording. So once that process is in stream after the call, I'll drop that up into the channel here. We're not able to edit the events once they've happened, which is a little annoying because it's nice to be able to put the links right to those things in the event itself. But what I did do in the event, in case you miss it on the home page itself, is I added in those 2 links to the bottom of the event as well. So they don't go directly to this month's, but it's pretty obvious that, hey, when you come over here, I'll create a new folder. If there's any presentation materials or anything that you want to share, Denis, I'll just drop them up into here and they'll be available for everybody from there. And likewise on the YouTube side, I'll take the stream recording, upload that up into YouTube, and everybody's got it. If you weren't able to join the session or you want to come back to listen to any parts, it'll be there and available for you. Quick sponsor plug I was going to put in. Actually, I had a really fun webinar this afternoon at lunchtime. We've got the video and the presentation up on our site already. So if you go to our extranetmusicmanager.com site and into events, you'll see that session. It was a kind of a conversational one I did with Benjamin Nyland from ShareGate and Kristen Buckley from Collab Talk, just talking about external sharing. So if you're curious, go have a check out on that side. In terms of upcoming events, actually, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to use our own events because these are actually upcoming ones people might want to be aware of. There's actually a UK-based conference that we're involved with called Comsverse. So it's running July 6th to 9th. Now, although it's out of the UK, they're actually running 3 tracks. One that's a Europe, Middle East sort of time zone focused, one that's a North America time zone focused, and one that's an Asia Pacific time zone focused. So there's sessions kind of across all those different time zones. So like mine are in, kind of weird time, 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight, 7 a.m. Eastern Daylight, but that's to address sort of the east-west coast of North America from there. So it is a broad Teams conference. It is free, so anybody can attend. They're actually doing some cool things because they're actually trying to build the feel of a virtual conference in a virtual space. So there's going as far as actually having vendor booths in a virtual reality space. If you've got an Oculus Rift or a smartphone VR or something like that, you can participate. I'm not sure how many people will jump into that, but we're going to give it a try and see how it works out from that point of view. So have a look at that if you're interested. The only other one really we have on our radar, we've got Ignite coming up, which was supposed to be in person. Microsoft's made all 2020 events virtual, so Ignite 2020 will be virtual as well as part of that. And then ECS, European Collaboration Summit, is still tentatively an in-person event in October. I'm a little skeptical. I figure that one's probably going to go virtual and turn into a spring event as well from that point of view. Bill, Denis, anybody else, other things that are happening that you want to share out?
Not really. You're a great accumulator of all of these events.
So I said I'd be watching the Q&A, and I don't have it open here, so let me open that up. I don't know if we've got questions from the crowd. We often start with a bit of a roundtable, just, hey, is there something cool that you're doing? Is there something you're stuck on you want to share and get ideas on? So either unmute yourself, go ahead and ask, that's fine. Ask it through Q&A, and I can repeat it through there.
Yeah, I just want to bring up a couple things that came out of PMP calls. The monthly call they were trying to do demos with search. They sort of had the new search process, and there is a sign-up page to get early access to the new search capabilities. If you go look at the monthly call from this month, when it was done on the second Tuesday of the month last week, there is a link someplace in the presentation to sign up for that.
If you've got one handy, you want to just toss it out through the meeting chat, that'd be great.
I don't have it handy. I didn't take it down. It was such a doc. They've had such problems with their calls the last few times, getting everybody to connect and present. Okay. And then on last Thursday's call, they were demonstrating, and again, they had problems. They only got one of the sections in, the new structure for PMP extensions with the new CSOM core stuff for SharePoint that'll now let you run basically code from any platform in the .NET platform, and eventually it's going to turn into the support for PowerShell.
Cool.
So that's coming. That's the new CSOM capabilities that they're releasing to be able to run it on Linux or the Mac.
Wow, that's amazing.
So they've been promising it for years. They're talking
Yeah.
about it coming out next month. They were talking about it in a week, so it may be out later. I don't think there's 100% coverage yet. But again, if you can do the REST calls, you don't have the problem either. So they're restructuring everything they do around the SDK support for that. So they are moving to neutral access to SharePoint from a code base. Those are the last two calls that had significant things that were being announced. There is an announcement that imminently that the 1.11 version of SPFX will release, and the only major change that's coming with that, there's a few other minor ones, is they will be supporting an app store for your SPFX code.
Oh my God, this is amazing.
So there's a lot of changes happening in that space, but they've been promised for a very long time. That alone is 2 years old. They've been talking about it. So.
Yeah, this is like Christmas.
Yeah.
So I don't know if people noticed, I just saw this light up in our tenant about a week or so ago. We now have audience targeting from a navigation point of view, from a news point of view. So, I mean, we've been waiting for this for years in the modern to be able to do that kind of thing. To hey, I want to.
Yeah, a couple of months ago they talked about it coming.
So it's live. This is the first release tenant. So nothing special other than we've got that checkbox set, and we're starting to see that show up now.
Yes, it will eventually roll out fully, but they talked about it coming, and the impact that it'll have a while ago. Again, a lot of every month when there's a call, or every week when they do it, there's often things talked about that they promise, but we don't always see on time.
Yeah. I don't know if I've talked about this in a past session, stop me if I have, but kind of pulled a couple of cool ideas together that I want to share it maybe in a future talk. So this is actually our production and Vision IT intranet site. I'm in the root site collection right now, and we have a hub site navigation associated with that. And if I go over to other ones within there, let's say, hey, I want to come into sales, for example, it's its own hub site as well. And what we've done is I've lifted and modified some open source code I found that allows you to define one hub site nav and then replicate that across all your others. So you sort of have a master hub site nav, and then we have 4 different hub sites in our tenant, and it just synchronizes those. So I've got a common global nav across that. And that audience targeting was kind of the last piece I was waiting for to say, hey, like here I've got a link to our management team, which only want a couple of key people to have access to. In the past, we just put it there for everybody, and if somebody didn't have access, they got an access denied when they went there. It's nicer to just have that disappear, which we've actually lit up on there now, and it's actually working really well. So global nav has always been something I've been really keen on. We took multiple passes at trying to build our own, SharePoint framework extensions and custom navs. It just got complicated. I like this idea to say, take the hub site nav, which is almost there, tweak a few things, and you've got a nice global nav solution that fits for a lot of purposes.
Do you run a home site?
Like a SharePoint home?
No, the SharePoint defined home site, which links to the SharePoint home.
Do you mean this one here?
Yeah, if you create a home site, then you'll have a link to go to your site there.
Yeah, you don't use it.
Yeah, it just goes back to our root site collection, which is a modern communication site.
Yeah, but that's something that's integrated now, so you can and that could be your hub site. It's the ability to do that information architecture for your structure. So
yeah, I like the ability to like we have a hub site for our clients. So then if I go down into a particular client here and say, okay, let's look at their site, and now I do a search up here. That hub site tree actually comes into the search experience. So right now I'm searching across that one client, or I could say, well, let's broaden that search to all my clients, broaden it across to the whole organization. I like what they've done, blending the hub sites and the search experience in the new Microsoft Search together. They've done a nice job.
Yeah, and you can go add your own targets, as that's what the part they're allowing for.
Yeah, I'm keen. I haven't had a chance to light up any of the stuff that you were showing last month, but I am keen to start pulling that in there too. Dennis, you just disappeared.
It's a trick.
He's bigger now.
Yeah.
Am I? Oh, maybe.
Your background stayed and you disappeared. It looked like you did a magic trick. There we
He's
go.
He's using an image background. He's got a halo around him.
Now there's just a background without anyone.
Oh, Eli's doing the live. You're in the driver's seat there, Eli. What the hell are you doing?
Nothing.
Hello.
Enough fun. We should probably let Denis dive into things from here.
We could start earlier, yeah, if you don't mind.
I haven't seen any other specific questions through the chat, so yeah, I think we're good too.
Okay. Okay, so before we begin, I just want to say, please ask questions and we'll stop them to discuss them. Otherwise, I think it's going to be weird if I just talk for an hour about this boring topic. It's going to be more entertaining if we have back and forth.
Yeah, feedback is always good.
Yeah, I prefer that. So hello everyone, and welcome to our session. Today we're going to be talking about large SharePoint migrations from SharePoint on-prem to Office 365, common pitfalls and best practices. My name is Denis Molodtsov. I have designed, developed, and delivered over 100 of customized SharePoint and Office 365 projects. I have also successfully completed dozens of migrations to SharePoint from various systems, mostly to on-prem. I mostly used to use my custom written utilities and scripts, but in the last several years, I've started using more tools because I cannot write a script every single time. So we'll talk about this in this presentation. To define a large migration, we'll take a study case. I want to mention that there are migrations that are a lot bigger than this one, but starting around this, starting from these parameters, you can and higher. This is considered large. So in our case, let's say we have at least 40,000 users. We have more than 10 years of history with sites where there were many owners. Owners left. There were many years of customizations. Some you know about, some you're completely unaware of. You have at least 4 terabytes of data. That could be 100 times more, but that's already considered large. And we'll have SharePoint 2010, but that might as well be 2007 and 13 or even later version. You might have 3 large farms and several smaller ones, which you all want to move to SharePoint Online. This is not unusual. I've worked with several clients which have more 5-10 farms each for various reasons. You might have also at least several hundred site collections, and you might have more than 10 SharePoint web applications. Large migrations, one of the main things about them is that they might take many months or even years, and this is what's different about them. And also it is highly recommended to have probably an external migration expert, although if you have one within your organization, then you're lucky and you probably don't need this presentation. Common mistakes and fallacies. I hear them still, but these are made by mostly IT directors or CIOs, CDOs that just want things to be modern and move to the cloud, but they don't necessarily know the important implications of this. One of the common mistakes is that clients expect that SharePoint on-prem is really the same as SharePoint Online. You can just shift and lift and turn it on and it's going to work like that. That could not be further from the truth. We'll touch on that later. Another problem is that you might expect to move everything to SharePoint Online. You might say, okay, I don't care how long it takes. We are not going to pay for SharePoint on premises. It's too expensive. We have servers, licenses. We don't want to deal with this. Let's just end it and move everything to the cloud. Easier said than done. In majority of cases, you'll probably not be able to get rid of SharePoint on-prem that easily. Another problem is that you treat migrations, and in particular SharePoint migrations, as a purely technical project. Somebody might ask a SharePoint administrator or a couple of developers or just a SharePoint department or even service desk to help with moving to the cloud, and hope that this should be done within a few months or weeks. But the truth is, it is not just a technical task. It's approximately 50-50 a technical task and a lot of communications involved. This brings us to the migration team roles. So these are the ones I collected and found, but you can also come up with or your own, so you can paste them in chat if you can suggest something else. So these roles are the ones at the top are the core of your migration team. And the same person, if you have a smaller team, can easily fit multiple roles. The same person, depending on their skills, communication skills, and maybe project management and the migration project experience, they can take 2 roles, for example. Migration coordinator, I think that role is necessary to have a healthy stack of sites to migrate. That person needs to know what we're migrating this week, next week, a month from now, and so on. You might also need to rearrange sites so that you take sites that are smaller and move them maybe during the day, and the ones are slightly bigger during overnight, and that the ones that are even bigger, you can schedule them to migrate over the weekend. There are even bigger ones. Some sites might take you weeks to migrate because they're so large. So this is a job of a migration coordinator role. Communication officer is a role that is overlooked very frequently, and this is a huge mistake. Communication officer is a very important role, a person who will connect with the stakeholders and site owners to make sure everyone knows about migration that's happening, what needs to be done before it, during it, and after. Another core team member is a migration officer. It's a person or persons that don't necessarily need to be super versed in SharePoint, as long as you have a well-defined guideline or a runbook for SharePoint migrations. Then this role will just be responsible for running migrations using a tool, following exact steps, and checking maybe post-migration checklist. A remediation officer is a person who is probably the most skilled in SharePoint and might need to fix various types of issues that will happen guaranteed before, during, and after migration. It could be ranging from custom development scripts to designer related and InfoPath related issues, including you need skills to suggest some alternatives, including SPFX, Power Apps, and Flow, and so on. So highly important role. And then you'll need just the usual roles that you probably already have in your organization, especially if it's a large one. So you'll need all your SharePoint administrators on top of other administrators. You'll have to coordinate with them for the duration of the migration project. Service desk will have a huge role because during migration and after migration, you'll have lots of requests coming their way, and you'll need to talk to them and explain what's happening, hand over to the service desk team members some materials they'll use to handle the requests, and maybe redirect some of them to you or to some other team members. You highly recommended to have a governance officer. This is not just because of migration in general, but specifically, but in general, you might need it. But the problem is, I've noticed that many clients start thinking about SharePoint Online governance during migration or towards the end of a migration. And it is highly recommended to get one specialist or role involved into outlining governance rules for your target destination. And then you'll have site owners and site stakeholders. Huge work will also be done by them. I'll explain what it means.
Denis, just to pause for a second there. Gennady had a question, just wanted to clarify the criteria around a large migration. Is it all of those things that you're talking about, all those different farms and such, or is it some subset of them?
No, you can have a farm which is used by 100 users, but if anything else applies, like it has 100 terabytes of data, definitely it's a large one. If you have many.
In your study case scenario, in this particular case was to take all three of these large farms, a couple of small farms, and move it all to SharePoint 20 on.
Yes, this is what. In fact. Well, I have a specific case in mind. I don't say which one, but in that case, it has, I think, 10 farms or so. And the idea was to move everything to the cloud, of course, originally. Yeah. Of course,
we find the same with mid-sized organizations. We've got a client right now, about 600 users, and they have SharePoint 2010, 13, 16, 19, and an orphaned SharePoint Online tenant that they're all trying to bring together into one new SharePoint Online tenant. So it's not uncommon, to have that scenario.
No. The bigger organization, the more farms they tend to have.
And that's not even that big of an organization. I mean, that's clearly in the mid-market size, at sub 1,000 user kind of size.
That's true. Yeah, true. I had we had a client with, I think they have around less than 5,000 employees. They have 14 farms, and they're still using them.
Haven't got them consolidated off all of those yet?
Not easier said than done. We can talk later why. But I first wanted to suggest let's consolidate them, and then we started talking about customizations they had, and I quickly lost my fervor because it's not that easy. Okay, so we were talking about various roles. So one of the first roles that you'll have to utilize is the communication officer, and that role will be responsible for collecting site owners. And first, it could be any other role like a project manager or migration lead. Could be even administrator who has the list of all sites with a respective site owner or a sub-site owner with their name, email. If you have it in your organization, you're super lucky. But guess what? Most clients I work with, they don't really have that list. And relying on site collection admins or site owners groups is not going to get you far enough. So the real true site owners are the stakeholders who are responsible for the entire site. They have the final say whether it's going to be deleted, kept, whether it needs any retention policies, whether it needs to be archived or migrated, which maybe documents are stored on the site. Is it going to be confidential or public documents? It's not any random person within that site who knows all of these questions. So step number one, you'll have to collect all of these site owners. Ideally. Now,
Denis, question for you. Is there tools that you recommend for just inventorying and figuring out all those site collections that you can then start to identify the site owners for?
Well, I wrote one tool that was hosted in Azure. It was just sending emails periodically. Unfortunately, it took at least half a year to collect like a fair amount of owners. I think there was one tool, don't quote me on that, but I think there was a Quest tool that can do something like that. But I know there are more that exist that do that.
I mean, ShareGate's got their Apricot tool. I think it's SharePoint Online focus. I haven't looked to see if it works for on-premise.
I haven't used it, but apparently it does wonders with some features in terms of governance. So
it's all about collecting who the owners are and are they actively using that site, which is a big part of what we want to do here. Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
There's this Microsoft migration assessment tool, which does pull out of every site who the owners are. Sorry, the admins are, I believe, and the owners. I can't remember. It gives you two sets. I have to go look it up again. But it also gives you additional metrics, which are handy, which are over the period of time that you're running it, you can see how many hits you've had against that site. So you can see what's active as well.
Mm-hmm. So Capita just made a suggestion I was going to touch on as well, which is just write some PowerShell to get the list of sites. In our team's provisioning open source stuff, we do have a script in there that will catalog all the sites for you. We haven't gone as far as getting a list of owners. I mean, this would be a cool sort of open source project, is to say, okay, well, let's write the PowerShell to collect that, and then just build a bot with a flow automation to go ping those owners and say, hey, are you still alive? Do you want this site? And
yes.
I think that's...
So for the so the way I built it 3 years ago, we first bothered everyone who is site collection admin, but in many cases, site collection admin is reserved for true admins only. Then you bother, let's say months later, it was adjustable. By default, it was 30 days later. With no response, you bother site owners. Then if none of them replies, or they reply as saying that they're not the owner, then you go to the stakeholders and you en masse start harassing them. Harassing, of course, not the
I mean, if you could do a little ML to say, okay, well, let's look at who's active and weight that more to recently active and say, okay, those are the people we probably want to go after. I mean, this begs some sort of machine learning automation type of solution to it, because as you get into scenarios like you're talking about, we got tens of thousands of site collections. You can't do that manually. You got to do some automation around that.
Right. Yeah, we can talk about this. It's a fascinating topic. I think what I want to say is that when you collect your site owners, first of all, expect it to take many months. And by the time you start migration, you might have 60 or 40% of site owners missing. You might also have a messy state where you have a site collection with 5 owners on different subsite levels. It might be because of the merging of departments and splitting of them, because you remember the site, the farm existed for at least 10 years.
It's going to be ugly. Just accept that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. There'll be a slide on that on the acceptance. So one idea is a little bit brutal, but this is, let's say, the last resort. So because you need these site owners to take responsibility at one point, you can first set a bunch of sites to a read-only state so that no one can edit or add anything new. And after a bit of a delay, then you can also lock it so that no one can access it. So the way it'll work, the stakeholders will emerge and identify themselves through service desk, most likely, unless they saw your pre-migration emails. So it's a bit brutal, but definitely works. Communications role, as I mentioned, it's a vital role, and I just want to expand on what it does. That person or role will be responsible for collecting owners. It might be responsible for giving lots of warning to the site owners. Give them at least 3 months, half a year, as much as you can before migration starts. I'll explain why the site owners need so much time in a few slides. Then, the same role will be over communicating with site owners and stakeholders. They will send lots of emails with so-called T-30, a month before, T-7, a week before, T-1, T+1. The same person might need to negotiate the scheduled migration date, maybe even some special requests that site owners might need. So this is a communication role. So it's almost a full-time job if you have a large migration. Things go wrong a lot, and you'll have to accept it. This is just what we talked about. The thing is, you definitely need to plan a lot. You need to analyze, you need to collect pre-migration reports. Things will go wrong. And this is not a bad or not a good thing. It's something that will happen regardless of what your expertise is. You just need to know how to deal with it. So step number one is to expect it. And things that will go wrong, all customizations will break, even the ones you think they shouldn't, that shouldn't. Stakeholders will miss communication emails and mid-migration emerge saying, hey guys, what are you doing? No one told me about that. I am owner of that subsite within a subsite and no one notified me. Quite typical. Site owners might be wrong site owners. There were cases where you would communicate with wrong people that are not site owners at all. They would be site owners just on one subsite, and there would be a root site with a different set of owners. So things will happen like this a lot, and you might need to get ready to roll back in some cases. Yeah, so why site owners and stakeholders is such a big role, and why you should give them plenty of time. So first of all, these site owners and stakeholders do not expect any migration. They have their own projects, they have their own project plans, they have resources planned for several months ahead, and now you expect them to just get ready to help with your migrations. That's not going to happen on a short notice. So site owners will need to plan the migration date with you. You'll have to give them time to prepare. They might need to secure budget that will include SharePoint resources, a new SharePoint subject matter expert if they have complex migration that somebody did in their department, but no one knows any more about anything. They might need to review customizations that they know about. It could be external customizations that are hosted outside of SharePoint and they just talk to SharePoint. It could be Access, it could be SSIS, it could be Python scripts, it could be Excel, and all sorts of things that you will not be able to discover on your own if you're not a site stakeholder. The same roles might be responsible for organizing post-migration tests. They are the users of the sites, and they are the only ones can tell you reliably if site actually moved fine and you can use it to do your business as usual activities. They also might be responsible for updating all of these external links that are pointing to SharePoint site and will all be broken. It's a lot of work, and expect them to spend lots of time and potentially request extra budget to approve changes somewhere within the next 3-6 months. User adoption officer. So it's a role that will be responsible for training users and populating knowledge database. Even though you might have experienced users who've been working with SharePoint for several years, their skills might need some updates, because in SharePoint Online things are quite a bit different, and you cannot expect them to be able to quickly, within a few hours to days, do a post-migration test and verify if everything is okay if they just never worked with SharePoint Online, right? So you need to prepare them. One of the recommendations is give them a sandbox SharePoint Online site to play with, have knowledge database ahead of time, have user adoption training meetings ahead of time, maybe once a week, twice a week, 1 hour each, when anyone can just jump in whenever they have time. Record these meetings so that somebody can watch them later. Another little thing, but surprisingly to me, everyone expects to have control over the URLs in the cloud. For SharePoint Online, I want to highlight it with a pen. So you see, the SharePoint.com part, it's something that will always have, will be present as part of your URL. Although I've seen one client where they actually were be able to create their own tenant on their own data center, and Microsoft somehow let them have their custom host name, but don't expect.
That's a very edge case, yeah.
Yes, this is, and Microsoft wants them away actually from the data center, so that's not supported officially.
Dennis,
so,
if I can jump in for a second, a couple of things that are hitting me. One of the things that we're finding is when we're doing these migrations now is that, everybody's talking about teams, and you can't talk about doing a SharePoint Online implementation without thinking about teams and saying, okay, the collaborative structure that we're going to build in SharePoint Online is very much a byproduct of the teams and channel structure that we're going to build from a teams point of view. Are you finding the same thing, and how much are you bringing that into the migration projects that you're seeing?
Unfortunately, I missed a third of what you said, but I can guess what you were asking is, or mentioning, is while you're doing migrations, there is actually Teams present already. There is Microsoft Teams used, and there could be hundreds or even thousands of Teams sites provisions.
No, it's not so much that. It's if you go back one slide for a second, or maybe it was two. Sorry, it was the idea that every project site is every site is a project, and part of that project is figuring out where does that fit in the new information architecture that we're going to be building online, and planning that information architecture we're finding is very Teams first driven. It's not about figuring out what hub sites and SharePoint sites we're going to create. It's about what teams and what channels those teams are going to have, and then SharePoint kind of falls out as a byproduct, and these sites end up going into team sites that are part of Teams, and really thinking about that whole piece of it. And if you go one more slide forward on the user adoption side, it's not about just SharePoint Online user adoption training. It's about the whole Teams and Office 365 because they're all joined at the hip and so tightly connected now.
Yeah, so I misheard of what you said because speech disappears randomly. So the thing is, every site migration, yes, it's a separate project. And one request that we didn't have, let's say, a year ago, 2 years ago is, and now we have a lot, is that site owners still have SharePoint on-prem site, but they already are in the cloud because they have one or more teams for their department. And they are saying, hey, we've been using that Teams connected SharePoint Online site. Why don't you just move everything there? And in our latest migration, we almost in all cases, we said no to that. I can explain later why. But the quick answer is that it's going to be messy. It's going to be hard to manage. And it's harder to migrate from old site to another old site while not making sure nothing breaks, while you make sure to have a URL naming convention, and then you have nothing you want to break. And Teams connected site, they also have a different permission structure. They use site owners are there, they're actually site collection admins, and all sorts of things are merged. So unfortunately, it's a lot messier to do this way. If you have lots of time, you can probably go case by case, and actually in many cases you can easily move just documents to their Teams connected modern site. But in our case, because we had so little time and just not enough resources, we couldn't afford this. But it is extremely common.
The point I was trying to make is, and I'm not sure if my audio is not working well or not, but the goal is often about modernizing as part of the migration, which means we're going to flatten all those subsites into modern site collections, and that we're going to create new site collections, but we're actually not going to create new site collections. We're going to create new teams that have site collections. So it's not about trying to get them into existing teams. It's about saying, before we create a modern team site, we should think about creating a modern team that has a team site, and then that underlying team site becomes the target. I don't want to diverge too much, but it's such an important part of most of the discussions we're having is you can't ignore the team side of it.
Yeah, and yes, that's actually I would love to talk more about this. Maybe
I have a comment on that. Do you transform on migration or do you migrate and transform?
Yeah,
wow,
that's
we
the
tend
argument,
to do it during
right?
migration.
It's a curveball question. So ideally, you before migration, you do as much cleaning and information architecture as possible, but you might not have any tools to do that. If you're lucky and you have them, you just do it before migration. If the only tool for information architecture transformation is the migration tool you just purchased, unfortunately, it's going to be during migration. If you, after migration, still have licenses that cover, let's say, I don't want to some migration tools allow you to have many licenses, like 25 licenses. It's more than enough to even
to spread that out.
Yeah, to other departments who can.
I mean, I don't know if your experience is the same. I've yet to meet a client with one of these legacy. We got lots of farms where they haven't had this deep sub-site structure that just doesn't work in a modern architecture, and you got to unwind all that as part of the. It's messy, it's horrible, but you got to go through that pain and get it cleaned up.
So what we think is, so basically, we can talk about this. Definitely during the next slide, so I'll come back to it. But
awesome, thanks.
Just wanted to mention here, so you cannot control URLs. So the company name will be here, your company domain. SharePoint.com will always be part of your URL, and then all of your site collections will be under either sites or teams. Although, yet again, I've seen a client that managed to get like a third or a fourth a custom managed path, but don't expect to get it yourself. Again, it's officially not supported. And also it means you might need to come up during migration with a naming convention for all sites you move, especially if you consolidate multiple farms and you might have the same site name across 2 or 3 farms, easily possible. You might have 2 ITs or 3 HRs. You might need to come up with a prefix that might be a farm name or a web application name, then dash site name, and so on and so forth. Next, so it's very important to do analysis. And don't try to approve the budget for your migration before you figure out how long it takes to move everything. It's not easily done. So I first recommend doing full pre-migration assessment project. It's going to be a separate project, separate involvement of one person at the very least. So you'll have to run some scripts. You might want to run SharePoint Migration Assessment Tool or SMAT. I don't remember if it works with SharePoint 2007. I think it doesn't, but don't quote me on that. Even if it doesn't, there are plenty of other scripts out there you could use to do analysis of your farm. Things that you're looking out for: alerts, BCS applications, email-enabled lists, large sites, full trust farm solutions, sandbox solutions. Do we have IRM retention policies? Do you have any locked sites, large lists, and info paths, workflows, and so on and so forth? So this is just the name of the report. Every report produced by SMAT tool will be a CSV file with many columns in it, and it'll have a lot of details, like a name, a URL, who modified it last, when, and how many items of this type you have, which application, farm, and so on and so forth. And you'll have to review it.
Bill did post in there, so 2010, 2013, 2016 is supported by the SMAT tool. I just posted a link. We use SP.kit quite a bit. It is a commercial tool, but it does a really nice job of analyzing the farm too, so you could use that too. So there are a number of different options there.
Yeah. This does not repeat what's in DocKit. This is completely different than DocKit. DocKit is a good health and review of what your SharePoint is. This is about what your risks and issues are going to be on a migration.
True.
Yeah.
Dockit doesn't tell you what's going to be a problem. It just tells you all the stuff that's in there. And you have to know how to interpret it.
And you'll probably want to
Yes.
run this more than once, and maybe want to filter. You can go and filter it down to run only certain tests. The key one that's in here is checked out files. You want to make sure when you do your migrations that you don't have any checked out files in here.
Yes.
Right.
In your,
Yes.
and
So
this
checked out
helps you with that
files-
report.
Yeah, so SMAT has checked out files, but SMAT only, in my experience, gives you maybe 60% of all reports that I think are important to me. And the ones that I think it's missing is, and I haven't seen a single tool that does it, but all pages with all web parts on them, including classes. Haven't seen a single tool that does it. That one we just have a script for. It's very easy to write, but you need a CSV file. And what I do, I get the list of all web parts and all pages, and then I cross-reference it, slice and dice, and for every site owner, I'll say, hey, you have these pages with these unsupported web parts. Be warned, after migration, they'll be gone. So this is something that I do, and I think it's super important. You warn ahead of time that will happen, not after migration occurred. Also important to have, and I think not all tools have it, is the list of activated features on all sites. In particular, you might be interested whether publishing feature is activated and whether it's activated on a sub-site, and you need a full list. Also very interesting and obscure, but default.aspx pages report, you might need it as well. Found it super useful because many sites, especially from 2003, 2007, 2010, SharePoint still have a homepage that's called default.aspx, and it doesn't even live in a SharePoint pages library. It's just in the root of the site, which is super deprecated years ago, but still keeps moving over with the previous upgraded SharePoint version. Then things like sub-site sizes you might need to get, and sub-site permissions. So all sorts of permissions for even a site list item level. Many tools produce it, and for some strange reason, SMAT doesn't do it, although you might just write a script that does it. It's not very hard to do. And one point about all of this. Yes, you'll get all of these fancy reports. You'll probably spend days and sometimes weeks making sense of them, especially if you never did it before. And you do all of this in order to ask questions. How long will it take to do migrations? So you collect these reports, you assess them, analyze them, try to really understand what these means to you, and try to predict what issues you'll have and how to treat every issue. We'll come back and talk more about how to estimate migrations later. As I said, one of the mistakes is you do not expect to have SharePoint on premises after you move to the cloud, right? Not true. Chances are you'll still need SharePoint on-prem. Get it ready early. Don't wait till the last months of your migration. Start preparing, start calculating how many servers you'll need in the farm, how many users will probably use it, how many web applications you'll need. All of that thing will also take you a lot of time. It's not only physical movement to the cloud that'll take time. The on-prem part will still be huge in many cases. Branding will be gone, although if you really want to, there are some ways to move it over, but master pages most likely than not will be all gone. Just that's pretty much it. Iframes, not a big issue, but for some reason I've seen it a lot. This is actually one of the reasons I collect list of all web parts and all pages in CSV files so that I can see page view web parts, and I can even see content editor web parts and script editor web parts and whether they have an iframe tag in it. And if you do have this, where does it point and what the URL is? If the URL begins with HTTP, boom, that's not going to work in SharePoint Online unless you have that external website with HTTPS, which is not easily done on a short notice. Another thing is that in SharePoint Online, by default, all URLs are blocked except for a few ones like YouTube and a few others. You can expect users to complain about this, and you might need to spend extra time unlocking these for them. Any questions so far? Actually, I don't see any questions, so if you see them, let me know. Another trend. Okay, thanks. Another trend I've seen a lot, and it's actually kind of nice to see, but also disturbing because it makes our lives harder, is legacy authentication in many farms in big clients with good security teams. They tend to say, we are not going to allow this security hole. We are disabling this. And this, just like this cheetah lock you see, this just gives you an idea of the legacy authentication risks. It is vulnerable to many types of attacks, and you don't want this to be enabled for, well, at least long term. Although if you really need to, you can keep it for half a year for a while, but you need to be very careful and understand the implications. So this type of authentication was replaced actually years ago by modern authentication, but modern authentication in many tenants now is the default authentication method without the legacy one. And because of this, you will expect many things to stop working. SOAP API will stop working. The classic CSOM library that many people love to use for integrations with SharePoint, it will stop working. Fingers crossed the CSOM core will be released soon. I can't wait, but if it's released, I'm certain it will support modern authentication. Otherwise, I'll be super disappointed. InfoPath 2013 and Designer will stop working. Well, with an easy fix, you can fix it. And just a registry key installation. But again, if you have many thousands of users in your organizations, you might just as well prepare a package for them that has InfoPath and Designer in it, along with Service Pack 1 and registry keys all bundled up. Otherwise, users will flood you with the questions about Designer not working.
I mean, it's not so much
sorry. Yeah.
The SharePoint thing. Outlook to me is probably the biggest one here. That, you know, Outlook, when you first provision an account into it, doesn't support modern authentication. So you need to create an app password for it, and it's a little awkward from that point of view. That's probably one of the biggest pain points we see from a modern auth. But I agree 100%. I mean, you shouldn't be allowing legacy authentication. There's huge stats on how many compromises are due to legacy authentication, and then the other about not having MFA, which I like is your next point here. So I'll segue over to you on that.
Yeah, I was debating whether I should put Outlook here, but I think the latest versions of Outlook, they all support modern authentication, and that app password is yet another security hole that's almost everywhere I've seen is disabled. And where it's not, I just recommended the clients to disable it as soon as they can. One of the reasons they couldn't do it quickly is that somebody still uses legacy Outlook versions that just cannot authenticate with SharePoint Online otherwise. So that's, I cannot say, I cannot judge whether somebody keeps legacy authentication or app passwords, but I'm just stating the trend. It's happening a lot. You'll see lots of tenants with no legacy authentication allowed, no app passwords. And you'll also see many tenants more and more with MFA. Microsoft really pushes MFA as a default setting across the board. As many of you probably already witnessed, it's easier said than done because many management tools for administrators still cannot authenticate properly with MFA, or they do, but there is a pop-up window that you cannot get around to automate things. So one thing that you can do, although I do not recommend it, but you can do it, is to request an exception for your migration accounts to have no MFA. If you have MFA enabled, that puts, say, an end to your dreams about automation of your migrations based on a schedule, and many other things that you wouldn't be able to do, won't be able to do with MFA enabled.
I mean, you can get a little more sophisticated and set up conditional access policies and say, okay, for this account on this machine trying to do this thing, and okay, we've got it fairly locked down. We're comfortable from a security point of view.
Yep. Yeah, and it's also not the end of the world, because even if you have MFA enabled, there is still a way to run your migrations based on a scheduled script. You can get, sorry, I should probably do it one line by line, but so permissions you'll need to do your migrations. Of course, you'll need farm admin on your on-premises farm, and in the cloud, you'll need SharePoint Online admin. It's at a very minimum to do migrations comfortably. Then, if you can get a global Office 365 person to help you with creating an Azure app registration and consenting to permissions to it, you can use that app registration to, well, do whatever you wanted to do for automation. This is how you get around the MFA limitation. Migration tools, there are dozens of them. I tried at least a dozen of them, and I actually completed large migrations with at least 3 of them. I never migrated anything super complex with migration tool, partially because it's slowly evolving, and now it's pretty good. It wasn't good enough only 2 years ago. You could start with this one because it will give you an idea of what you want from a commercial tool. It's also free to try. It's also not bad at all. The latest version of it is pretty advanced. One of the limitations is that it cannot move things to SharePoint Classic sites, although many of you will argue you don't want to move anything to the Classic sites. But if that's not a problem, try it first. Another one is ShareGate. Everyone heard about this. I highly recommend this. It's relatively cheap, and it does the job very well. It's not buggy at all. Support is good. It's just my personal favorite. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, just personally love them. And then if you want anything more complex, and I shouldn't say complex, if you want a cluster so that you want to run multiple migrations from 5 to 10 servers to speed things up, because you might have calculated that your migrations take 200,000 hours physically to move. Now you need to come up with an idea of how to automate migrations. How do you do a cluster in parallel? Do either of these two, AvePoint or Metalogix. Of course, Metalogix was bought by Quest. Still call it Metalogix Content Metrics, and AvePoint has a product called DocAv. And by the way, all of these tools, if you purchase them, will have some sort of a pre-migration report. By all means, use them. They do have reports that do not include what. Actually, I shouldn't say Metalogix has a report. By the way, they don't. AvePoint and ShareGate have reports that SMAT tool does not have. So by all means, try it. It's super useful. Did I mention? Yeah, that's good. So let's talk about migration duration estimates. So this is where I'm really surprised some people get it wrong. When you collected all your analysis reports, now you have almost all information to do the migration duration assessment, but many people don't do it. They just look at number of gigabytes or terabytes, and they just do back on the envelope calculations and think they know the predicted time. Don't do this. I highly recommend running multiple migrations. Do 5, 10, 20 migrations and measure times very carefully with different types of migration options. Yes, it'll take you several days, probably, maybe a week, but if migration ends up lasting several years, these days will be well spent. You want to know ahead of time how many hours in total it'll take to move everything to the cloud. If the total number will be completely crazy, it might say 50,000 hours, 100,000 hours. This is where you now need to seriously plan how to deal with it. What will end up in SharePoint on premises, because it's so large, it's faster to move there. Can you retire something? How much can you clean? Can you run multiple migrations from 10 servers at the same time? Which software are you going to use, FPoint or Metalogix or something else? And do you have enough servers requested? How many servers will you need? How many people you'll have to have? Because if you run multiple migrations at the same time every day, you'll have lots of remediations to do, and you might need to hire extra remediation officers who would need to spend lots of their time doing nothing but remediations. So do migration duration estimates ahead of time as early as you can. Any questions? So this is a very simplified set of steps for a typical site. The real one includes probably 30, 40 steps, but in general, you first over-communicate with the site owners, make sure they know about migration coming. On the date of the migration, you set the site to read-only state, although there are some exceptions I can explain. Then you do the migration of this site. Let's assume the site takes 2 to 24 hours to move. In this case, by the time it's moved and next day users come back to test it, they'll be able to move to the new one and forget about the old one. If they confirm after, let's say, a day or a week, or in some cases several weeks, that they are satisfied with the way new site works, there are no bugs that prevent them from working with the website and doing their business as usual, you log the site, meaning it will be no longer accessible to anyone. So between the fact that site is moved and you lock it, there'll be multiple stages that are done by technical team, migration team, site stakeholders, site owners. That will include communications as well. But these 4 steps are the just main simplification. Another thing is that you don't necessarily want to set your site to read-only when you move it. For cases where the site takes days to move or weeks. In this case, you have to keep the original site running and not locked because the work should continue. And unfortunately, it'll mean you'll probably need to run multiple Delta migrations over and over again every several days against the same site. But you want to avoid it as much as possible. This is why I highly recommend setting the site you migrate to read-only, so that you avoid Delta migrations, which might take half of the time it takes full migration, or even 30%, could be days or many hours. So there is a checklist for what to watch out after migration. This is what you can do probably both as a site owner. Apologies, just kind of sore throat. So you can do it both as a site owner, stakeholder, and a post-migration remediation officer or a migration officer. So after your script is run, it could be a tool. Verify that everything checks out. All subsites were moved, all libraries, all documents, folders, even a number of versions. Do you have any pages missing, like home pages? Like a default ESPX page, for example. Are there any missing workflows, info paths? Are there any discrepancies in permissions? Do you have hundreds and hundreds of users missing because maybe mapping, user mapping is wrong? This is partially will be done by you and partially will be done by the site stakeholders. Highly time consuming. I highly recommend automating this as much as possible. Some tools already have compare script included, which you can customize. But one of the problems is that these compare scripts might take many, many hours to complete. So yet another problem there. post-migration issues. Issue number one that I've seen over and over again, and I would say it's somewhere between 40 and 80% of all requests that'll come toward you. It's permission related. Some users will lose access for whatever reason. They might not be able to get to their sub-site because they never had access to the root site. Their AD groups did not move, or there were some differences between everyone group in SharePoint on-prem and everyone except external users in the SharePoint Online and so forth. So permission-related issue is the one that'll have many subcategories, but that's the main category. Then in different random order, it's going to be things like blank pages, missing web parts, missing navigation links, missing documents and list items, broken info path forms, and it could be many more. Just an example. Before you before you rush into opening your lovely migration tool and start moving as many sites as you can, stop and just prepare and organize yourself, because you need to be prepared for many things that are coming. And you start with proper catalog of all your sites. Every site will have many columns. It'll have a old site URL, new site URL. It'll have things like site owners, maybe even stakeholders, everyone who needs to be notified by email. You might need to have predicted duration of the site migration, scheduled migration date, whether T-30, -7, -1 emails were sent, and many, many other things. You want it to be stored and vigorously maintained over the period of your entire migration. Start with this first, even though you're probably eager to try all of these migration tools. Don't do it right away. Start with a proper catalog. If you do this later on, you'll realize that this is highly you can easily automate this with either PowerShell to schedule migrations. That's pretty nice to do. You can also do email notifications using Flow. You can use your Excel file or SharePoint list or even a SQL database if you prefer this for storing. You can use it as a data source, and Flow will automatically notify site owners whether migration is done, whether it will be done, and when, and so on and so forth. Then you can add many other automations on top of that. If you want, I can mention which ones we've added. You'll also, using the same list, you will vigorously use it to catalog and write down all statuses. It could be multiple statuses. There will be no just one status for every site. It's not like preparing, in progress, and done. No, you'll need to have multiple statuses. Migration status for physical migration. Is it moved or not? Scheduled date. It can also be moved frequently if you have negotiations with site owners. If maybe migrations keep failing and you keep rolling back, that will keep changing. Communication statuses. When was the last time somebody was notified? And instead of storing this, I highly recommend storing a status that says just T-30, T-7. Now you know which type of email was sent last. And based on the scheduled date, you can guess when it was sent. Site lock status, whether it's in read-only or it's locked. This is what you probably want to share with Service Desk, because Service Desk will start having issues, requests where users complain about 403 error. That means site was locked. And if Service Desk has your list, they can say, okay, this site was locked on such and such date for migration reasons, and this is a migration, and this is a migration team, and this is a site owner, please contact them. So yet another reason to work with Service Desk and to keep this list. Also, you might need to have a sign-off status, because migration of the site is not done until site owners say so. If they say after a week, that physically migration was complete. They say they're not happy with something and they cannot do their job, basically. You'll move back and your migration status will worse nothing. Unsupported customization examples. It's one of the mistakes that I mentioned, is that you expect SharePoint on-prem to be identical to online, and things like your farm solutions will not work. Office Store apps, even though they're supported on-prem and online, you will not be able to easily move them. I was able to move one app with a data source once, but it was more of an unsupported hack rather than a supported way of moving things. Your custom scripts will most likely break. Your sandbox solutions will most likely break unless it's a sandbox solution that contains a site template or something simple. InfoPath forms with managed code and SOAP calls, workflows with managed code will move, but will stop working after migration. You'll have to either remediate this and rewrite this form or a workflow before migration or after. The earlier you tell site owners that they have them, the better. This is why you need to spend time to analyze pre-migration reports and let site owners have them so that they can see for themselves. And site owners might not be technical enough to see huge spreadsheets with nonsensical columns, so you need to make sure it's human readable. And SMAT tools and other tools do not produce reports that, let's say, your grandmother can read. Make sure it's easily understandable by working on ETL. Another common mistake is that you expect to just take SharePoint on-prem, move it elsewhere or to another on-prem or cloud, and expect all of the integration just to keep working. It's possible if you move from on-prem to on-prem and URLs don't change with the magic of load balancers and DNSs. But imagine you have all of these integration points that do not live in SharePoint. They're external. Your pre-migration tools or scripts will not be able to find them all. In some large sites, there could be a site owner who is not aware of integration points because some of their citizen developers is using a Python script to integrate with SharePoint, and he never told anyone about this. And all of a sudden, it's a big deal. Your SSIS will stop working. Maybe SSRS reports your .NET applications, including the ones that you wrote with CSOM and SOAP and maybe REST. Your external website will have many links that link to SharePoint's on-prem site. You can have like Confluence, ServiceNow, emails, other wiki pages, Jira, with many links that will break. You need to be ready for this. And this is one of the jobs of a site owner to know that it will happen and get ready for this, because it can be a big disruption when the move occurs and you log the original site.
Denis, a question from Aaron. Any considerations when migrating Record Center?
Good question. So the way, yeah, that's a pretty good question. Well, we never moved it as is. Unfortunately, we just lost customizations. We moved the files that were still in Record Center, but we didn't have any paths, or whatever you call them, the transition paths, whatever they're called. So the Record Center was always just moved as a team site, as a team site. So that Record Center template just got replaced with a team site and all documents were moved, but we did not have to keep that Record Center feature. I'm not even sure it's still supported in on SharePoint Online. Is it still, is Record Center still a template available?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Not sure if others are familiar one way or the other. I guess the bigger question is, are those still retained as records, and all the retention policies around them still apply back to when they first came in? And even though you've moved them to a different environment, I don't know what wrinkles that brings in. I haven't run across that specifically ourselves. Not sure if you have, Denis.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So in many cases, you might start thinking about retention policies and deletion policies using labels. You can use Azure or Office 365 retention policies. And that's a different retention policy type. So you might get everything replaced with a new one. And this is what, unfortunately, frequently happens during migration. For example, you might have 15 years of data in your old SharePoint site, and you might have a default deletion policy that deletes everything after 9 years. And as soon as you move your site, you realize that you have 3 years worth of documents missing because of that deletion policy in place. So I would just start using new retention policies that are available in the cloud rather than using the old ones, but it might not be that easily replaced because new retention policies are also quite restricted, and the high control, unfortunately, is only available in the, I think, either E5 license or, yeah, you probably need E5. The E3.1 license has okay retention policies, but it might not be too flexible for what you actually wanted to do.
Right. Cool. Thanks.
And I realized actually I've been talking for an hour, 15 minutes, and we have 10 more slides. So I can either wrap it up and we can do Q&A, or if everyone is okay, I can just blast through the last 10 slides, spend maybe 10 seconds for each.
I don't think you need to blast. I mean, we are scheduled till 8:30, and we've been doing questions as we've been going, which I personally like. I mean, it gets that back and forth happening during the session. So people feel free to keep asking questions through the chat.
I do have one question for Denis. It's around users and accounts. One of the problems I've run into in migrations are where you have version control and a user account from 3 years ago, which is no longer valid in my AD and won't be in my new Azure AD, needs to be in place in order for that to migrate properly. Is there a workaround for that?
That's interesting. I'm not sure I understand the issue.
We have this one with one of our clients right now, which maybe what you're asking about, Bill. We're actually doing an AD consolidation with multiple organizations and a conversion to Azure AD all at the same time. And it's kind of a chicken and egg because we want to consolidate the AD, but as soon as we do that, then permissions get messed up in the old SharePoint. We can't move to SharePoint until we get the consolidation done to get all the Azure AD accounts. So what we're doing is we're writing PowerShell to go fix up the permissions at the user and group level in the old SharePoint while we do the AD consolidation. Once we're done that, then we start migrating the sites across. So it's tricky, but it's doable.
Yeah, I wouldn't start migration before it's sorted out.
In this case, it's accounts that were deleted years ago that no longer exist in the system, and you don't discover them because in SharePoint, it kept track of the user by being in the user information list, so it didn't care whether it was in the AD anymore.
Yeah, I guess it depends if you need it for historical purposes. I mean, we use ShareGate a lot, and you pick one user to map those people to, but I mean, if it was important, you could create those accounts just to migrate it across.
That is the solution we use. We temporarily, we discover them and then fix it. The other one is if somebody's used people picker type fields, that also comes up. That it can't find the user on the migration, so the records don't work correctly.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest gotcha I know in migration is around user accounts from years ago that no longer exist.
We actually have this issue all the time. I just wasn't sure what you mean it wouldn't migrate. Yeah, of course, the user that doesn't exist in AD, it won't be present. So this is why we come up with a service account that will be a placeholder for the case where user is not found, so that it's not your name of the person who runs migration will show up next to the document. It should be somebody else, like a system account or anything, but not Denis Molodtsov. It should be a placeholder. For migration of the user accounts that were moving from one AD domain to another, and some users might have 3 accounts and only one of them is active, or 2 out of 4 are active. This is why we spent a lot of time, unfortunately, to come up with a solid mapping, user mapping, and we have to update it every several weeks so that it's has everything. And we had to write a script that consolidates many different sources, including users that we extracted from hidden user list, from HR system, from AD, and from Azure AD, and we just consolidate this, cross-reference, and try to guess what would be the best fit. And also, unfortunately, the final list might be so massive, it might take like 2 hours to import to a migration tool. I'm not going to point fingers to say which tool it is, but the way we fixed it is we had to crawl through all permissions in all SharePoint farms and only keep the records in the mapping list, the ones that exist in SharePoint. And this is how we managed to cut, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of records to just 100,000.
I mean, it's an important point is, I mean, we often encourage getting rid of a lot of that broken permissions, inheritance, that's a mess that nobody actually cares about 5 years later, and simplify that. Just side topic, we've lit up the chat here when I said, hey, questions coming, which is a good thing. I love it. So I just want to share a couple of things from in there. Embry's got a couple of great points. One was to this point about, non-existing users, just keep a migration log so you've got an audit history of who those were from a past point of view, even if they get mapped to a generic user as migration. I like that idea. I also had a comment with it back to the record center point that, kind of echoing what you said, Denis, of, let's use the Azure labeling and retention that is not SharePoint specific or email specific. It's kind of cloud general, and that doesn't even exist from an on-premise point of view, but adopt that going forward, because that's what Microsoft's strategy is, and figure out how to align your migration into that new strategy.
For the missing users, last time we built a migration dashboard that automatically shows all issues extracted from the migration logs, and it shows to site owners on their page or the dashboard all users that were missing. And more often than not, the site owners just confirm, yep, all of these no longer work in the company. But sometimes they say, oh, this is other account that I still use, but it has maybe a slightly different name or something. But that's how we do. Not every account that failed to migrate it no longer exists. It might have just a slightly different naming convention or domain or something. Or maybe your mapping file just is plain wrong, which is quite possible.
Right.
So SharePoint on-prem, just wanted to mention that you need this to host business critical customizations. They'll take you too much time to implement. So just so that you probably still need to have on-prem environment prepared. Customization replacements. I'm a little bit surprised when I hear people saying InfoPath is dead, workflows is dead. It's all nice to hear, but hear me out. If you have a farm with 1,000 InfoPath forms and 100,000 workflows, you can just tell the company to rewrite all of this. So you will migrate most of it. You'll have no choice. And you might as well recommend moving, like introducing Power Platform with Power Automate and Power Apps, but it's going to be a small handful of apps and flows. Otherwise, you'll just spend a decade rewriting this.
It'll be years, yeah. Just please don't start a new InfoPath project today in SharePoint Online.
And this brings us to the question whether your company already knows how to deal with the Power Platform governance. This is why you might need a governance expert, or at least a person who spent a few weeks learning how to do Office 365 governance as they never did it before, because you cannot allow every single site owner to just start using blasting apps and flows without control. Although I personally would love to see that, but I think you will need some tools to support them, because they'll come back to you and ask for help. And if you're not ready to help them, that's a big problem. Farm solutions are not going to migrate, so you'll have to either move them to on-prem or just rewrite them with anything you want, Power Apps, SPFX, or Azure Web Apps. Custom designer pages will just not migrate yet again, so either move it to on-prem or Power Apps or SPFX, or just use modern pages. They're pretty good. Maybe that'll work for you. Knowledge database, highly recommended. You don't want to ask every single question that site stakeholders ask you. Also, you don't want to answer every single question. Specifically, and you don't want to answer every single email. Instead, if you see a trend, 2 same questions coming over, create a KB article that is high quality with many examples, screenshots, maybe videos. That would be too much time to spend for one email, but totally worth it if you know that 100 other users will come back to you. Prepare. So in our case, I would say somewhere between 30 and 120 knowledge database articles will probably have you covered for the migration project, if it's a large one. User training, highly recommended. You might run weekly seminars that will focus on 2 main topics or 3. What you need to do for migrations and after migrations, what are the new features in the new platform, and how to deal with basics of SharePoint permissions, because many site stakeholders will still not know how to do this, or just they don't remember. And this is, since it's a issue number 1 after migration, you might as well overtrain them to make sure they know how permissions work. And this is where knowledge database should also cover this topic. User training tips. It's a frequent one, but it's a small thing to mention. You'll hear lots of questions about Explorer view not working. Say in Chrome, instead of saying just open Internet Explorer, say, you know what, actually, new SharePoint version is pretty good with drag and drop and then loading multiple documents. So you might just learn how to use it. Also, you might try sync tool, the sync button. I especially despise using the word OneDrive for Business sync tool because it confuses users a lot. I just call it a sync button so that they understand what it is instead of saying, oh, I actually use OneDrive. No, I just call it a sync tool, just a little tip to avoid confusion. Also recommend them to stop using Designer because they'll come back to you with questions that they cannot do something with Designer. If possible, instead of answering that Designer-related question, try to suggest an alternative or suggest a TB article that lists the alternatives. If you can't suggest anything good, okay, that's maybe a question either for service desk or for a seminar or something else. So, but as much as you can, stop recommending Designer and InfoPath. Important types of requests. You'll get new types of requests that you never had before in your farm, in your old farm, and you'll, by the same extension, you'll also have no requests that existed before. You won't hear requests to install a, let's say, a farm solution in your SharePoint Online because it's impossible. But you'll have, let's say, 10 new request types in SharePoint Online. And this is yet again where governance is important, because while you're doing migration, now you realize you have a new platform that has no rules or regulations, or maybe a list of all sites with list of all owners. Have it in place as soon as you can, and expect your service desk to know how to deal with all of these questions. And also a big one is you'll probably have many requests coming your way about the Power Platform and flows because it's such a cool product. And many users won't want to wait for it. If you can just say, go ahead and use it. Before doing this, prepare for the influx of all of these requests. And if you allow this, get ready to know how to deal with the governance, how to change, let's say, Power App owner if somebody leaves, how to take ownership of the flow, how to discover how many of them exist, how to know how many flows are used to that consume all of your pools, and maybe some flows that run too many runs per day, per minute. So you need governance tools of some sort. You need to prepare. Common requests, just wanted to repeat the new ones in SharePoint Online. It's managed permissions, of course, even though it's still topic, still highly popular. Things like creating new sites, sub-sites, questions around some functionality that doesn't work any longer in SharePoint Online, or maybe they cannot find a link to a document after migration, that the answer could be as easy as just giving them the link. And if you have a tool that converts on link to the new one as maybe a form, that's awesome. It will help you a lot. You'll be asked to maybe activate some features that by default are not activated. And you might already have something similar in SharePoint on-prem. And you might have a ton of request types that people can request, but they will not be the same in SharePoint Online. So review it, see which request types still make sense to have and which won't. And also define which role will be responsible for each request type. Just prepare a matrix with all request types and roles and departments and admins and maybe migration teams that will deal with it. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thanks, Denis. We've got a bunch of questions queued up here. Why don't we maybe start with some of the easier ones? Tips on using the syncing tool, users not realizing when they delete the local files, it actually deletes them out of the server as well. I mean, there's a recycle bin there, but they'll only live there for so long. Thoughts on that one?
In SharePoint Online, if you can introduce a retention policy across your entire tenant that maybe retains at least for a year or maybe 7 years. The only disadvantage is that if you don't have much space, extra space can be purchased in SharePoint Online, but the more you buy, the more expensive it gets. The first, let's say, terabyte will be relatively cheap, and then it'll be very expensive.
Right. Another question here from Kavita. How do you handle user experience during migration? There'll be this transition point where some of the stuff is SharePoint on premise and some of it's SharePoint Online. And I'll throw my thoughts in here. What we often do is we actually modify the old SharePoint on premise site so that things like global navigation, when you go to that department, well, that's already been migrated. It actually takes you to the SharePoint Online, and when you go back from SharePoint Online to the other department site, it takes you on-prem, and it's awkward because it's a different user experience, but at least it still feels like one site, and you're navigating people both ways, back and forth. Because this can take months and months before you're through that migration. Denis, thoughts on your side on that?
I couldn't probably suggest anything apart from that. It's a good idea. Well, things like that I would do on smaller migrations. I did it, but this is more about large migrations. And unfortunately, in the last ones, I just wouldn't have time to do this. It's very high touch, high quality, like white glove treatment for your site owners. If your site owners can do it themselves, they could help themselves and just modify navigation if they know just subsite is being moved. But also, it could also help with transition, having a sandbox site for a department that they can use to do POCs, get used to the new user interface. Maybe they can prepare with new web parts in modern pages. That maybe.
But I think the big point is, I mean, as you get into these larger migrations, like a 4 terabyte migration, you have no hope of completing that as a cold turkey over a weekend, Friday at 6 p.m. to Monday morning, you're done. Like, it's just not going to happen. So you need to expect that there's going to be this, some of the old and some of the new, and you got to make that part of your communication strategy of how do we avoid the confusion that's inevitably going to happen and try and mitigate that as best you can.
So it's a good question. It depends on how big your site is. The vast majority of sites, I would really hope so, would be several hours to maybe 30 hours to move. In this case, you can just move them during the weekend even. Why not?
Yeah, I don't mean on an individual site. I mean the organization as a whole. Like you've got tens of thousands of sites and terabytes of content. Like you're never going to get that whole project done in a weekend.
Oh, no.
So
no.
you got to expect that people need to live in both environments.
Yeah, that actually brings us to like a bigger question. Is there a way you can automate and do discovery of all external things that point to SharePoint, and how to avoid broken links and whatnot? I've done something like that with scripts in the past. Wrote a crawler that would just collect all SharePoint links that have a URL starting with a certain thing, and then you just provide it as a report. But it's just one little thing that probably will help a little bit, but doesn't provide you the whole like smooth transitioning that somebody wants. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to this.
Okay. Quick point. Somebody just asked, are the recording available afterwards? Yeah. So there's a link both in the event itself on the TSPUG as well as in the details on the main TSPUG homepage to the YouTube channel where you get these recordings. And also, Denis, are you comfortable sharing your slides? I can post them up there as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so we'll post a copy of the slide deck up there too. There were quite a few questions in there that I've kind of skipped over on the whole Teams first side of things. Denis, do you mind if I grab the screen? I've got a couple of things I just want to share with people on that.
Yes.
I just have a quick question for Denis about migration strategy around my sites. Where does that fit in? Is that something you should do early or late?
Did somebody want to answer this?
No, it's a question to you and your strategies for large migrations. All those
they
users
could be independently done. Usually OneDrive is just like a separate migration project. I treat it as a separate migration project. I don't call it technically SharePoint migration project. I haven't done a bunch of those.
There tends not to be any customizations or things like that to worry about there. It's really just moving documents. But yeah, you're right. It could happen before, during, or after part of the main migration.
Yeah, it could be just a larger project of introduction OneDrive for business in your organization so that your profile lives there and it's very popular. So while that happens, that kind of project will take care of it. Okay. I wasn't involved in projects that would take your user profile and store in OneDrive. Unfortunately, I don't have experience there.
Just one other question related to that. Is a prerequisite, do you have a list of prerequisites before you start a migration that should have been looked after in the tenant?
Yes, although I'm not sure I can share it, but so I wrote a dashboard. Unfortunately, it's internal, but I hope to write this so that it's publicly available on GitHub. Haven't started yet, but imagine you have a dashboard and then you open it up as a user, type your site URL name or name, part of the site URL or name, and it shows you all the prerequisite steps, and it's a big list. And it takes the data from SMAT and other reports. It shows you, hey, you have 10 default ASPX pages, you have HTML pages, you have email-enabled lists, and it has URLs to each. And it says you have master pages, and these are URLs. So it's a big list. So you have this. Also, after migration is done, the same dashboard shows on a different tab post-migration things that you need to address as soon as possible. It could be missing documents, missing navigation links, I don't know, web parts broken, and it's also listed. Can I share it somewhere here? I mean, I could maybe share a screenshot, but I'm not sure how it's going to be helpful because every separate site has a different list of things you need to do before migration. And it's such a big list of all possible things. It probably, it doesn't really, I don't really have it in one place. It's too large. I can mention a few things like I did about master pages and checked out files and whatnot. It's a big list.
I think that's good enough. That's what I expected.
Okay. Just touching on Ambreen's comment here, similar to what I was saying, kind of expanded on it in the chat if people want to have a look there of, using navigation to try and keep that connection between in the old and new, but going further than that and modifying the master page to have some notes on the old sites to say how this is now over here, putting redirects in there, making it read-only. There's a number of things that you can do to guide people and try and avoid that confusion because they are going to end up at old URLs and broken links and things like that. So as much as you can, try and address that to redirect that traffic. So just circling back to where we were chatting early in the session on this teams first idea and how teams, in my opinion, really needs to be part of the thought process in here. This is a bit of an ugly slide. It used to be a slide that I used that talked about the 3 places to work from a SharePoint point of view. You either had your private by default in OneDrive for Business, you had your collaborative sites in Team sites, and you had your publishing sites or communication sites. And Teams has really mixed this up, and we can no longer talk about SharePoint as a place to work independent of Teams. If I'm doing chats with people and I'm sharing files, those files are in my OneDrive for Business. If I'm having channel conversations and I'm referring to documents, those documents live in the underlying team-connected team site and in folders associated with the channels that I'm having conversations. So it's so baked into the IA as part of that. So as we're doing migrations, we're very much thinking about, we use MindJet to build information architectures, and we used to just focus on SharePoint to say, okay, what are the top level sites and subsites? We don't build subsites anymore, but same idea there. But now we're really saying, what, we need to think about the IA from a teams first point of view to say, okay, this is actually an example IA of how we organize Envision IT ourselves. We create teams for each of our clients. Those teams have channels which represent projects that we're doing with them. And there's an underlying team connected team site, and there's folders for those channels where those documents live, and use sections in OneNote and project streams channels all wired in as part of that. So you really have to think about that holistic Office 365 view when you're planning this out. And my point wasn't that we're trying to migrate into the existing teams. It's really figure out what this net new IA looks like for your organization, that you can't ignore the fact that Teams is likely going to be a part of that, and then your migration becomes part of that. It's not about creating new modern sites and flattening your subsites into that modern site structure. It's about creating new modern teams that happen to have team sites underneath them, and baking all that as part of that. So just wanted to share that thought with people. I don't know if others are seeing the same thing, that even before COVID, Teams was our focus, and that's our starting point in most of our conversations. It's not what do you want your team site to represent in your organization. It's what do you want your team and your channel to represent in your organization, and then everything else kind of falls out from there. So I don't know if that answered the questions that people had about how do we bring teams to the forefront, or what does teams first look like. I mean, that's what we're seeing on our side. A couple of people saying, yeah, Teams is driving us online. That's another reality. Is Teams adoption was hockey sticking already before COVID came, and then it just went to a straight up vertical line almost from an adoption point of view. So yeah, it's just driving everything right now.
I've seen several clients that adopted Teams during COVID pandemic, which didn't have SharePoint Online to begin with, and Teams was the first product that just, or service that punched that hole so that everyone got interested in SharePoint Online.
Yes.
And then it triggered SharePoint migration.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that too. And I mean, from that Teams first point of view, we're actually working on a maturity model for Teams to say, okay, as an organization, where do you fit? Because we find that, in that scenario you just described, Denis, where senior leadership says, we're just going Teams. We don't even know what SharePoint Online is. We don't care. We need remote working. I mean, everybody just starts chatting, and nobody even knows what a channel conversation is or a team site underneath that. And that's kind of the, walk before you run first stage of Teams. And we want to help move people to the, okay, IM is great, but channel conversations with conversational history and all the cool stuff that Teams is supposed to do, that's even way better. So let's figure out how to move you there and bring the team sites and such along with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Another question just came in around governance. Who should create groups? What about external sharing? Actually, I think that was Aaron that asked that question. Shameless plug. I mean, check out my noon hour webinar today. It was all about that. Ben talks a lot on that. I do as well. Just, thinking about governance and who should create and external sharing. There's lots of top content there. Question from Kavita. So subsites should all be gone. Yes, they should be. Disadvantage with subsites is just the inflexibility. And I didn't get this for the longest time. Dan Holm, who's now senior product manager at Microsoft, he used to be an MVP like myself and Eli and a number of other folks on TSpug. And 10 years ago, he was preaching, subsites are evil. Everything should be a flat site collection. It's just easier to reorganize things. And I was like, yeah. I don't really get that. I am so on board now. I realize now in hindsight, having gone through that unwinding of a deep subsite structure that's very fixed and rigid and difficult to adapt as the organization changes to a flat model. And you can still do things like hub sites and have sort of a logical hierarchy, even though they're not a direct hierarchy. It's just so much better there. So yeah, I'd say absolutely subsite should be gone.
The only problem is in very large organizations, if you try relying on hub sites, you can hit that 2,000 hub sites limit, because if you have an intake form where you can request a hub site to be created, and it would accumulate or combine multiple subsites, some departments might request 10 of them. And then if you have many such requests, 2,000 might. We did some calculations recently and came to a conclusion that 2,000 is dangerously low number. I think there were some rumors that will be increased even further, but I didn't see the promise that it will happen actually soon. I think it will, but just hopefully it'll be soon.
My context is more the couple hundred to a couple thousand user organization where that may not be an issue, but yeah, as you get into the bigger orgs, that's definitely a concern.
Yeah, because you might have, let's say, 200,000 subsites. If you imagine that many site collections, and you need to somehow combine them in this unifying with navigation, you might really see that 2,000 hub sites is not a big number.
Right. Okay. I'm just scanning back up to see what we might have missed through there. I think we had a lot of really good questions. I like the back and forth. That was nice. Seeing anything specifically there. Just going back to the bottom to make sure I didn't miss any new stuff there. Give people a minute if there's any sort of last closing questions. Dennis, do you have any sort of wrap up points or things you want to share?
I just wanted to thank you for inviting me and for letting me present. I really enjoyed so many questions and quite a few attendees. I honestly wasn't sure that migration topic is such a hot topic, but apparently I was wrong. If possible, maybe in a few months, I would like to do more, because migration is such a big topic. I really wanted to speak fast to cover as much as I could, but I think it could be 10 hours to a few days to cover everything I really wanted to say. Just didn't have enough time.
Yeah, I think the reality is that these are often big, long, messy projects, and you got to do your best to contain that, but you're gonna have to deal with some of it too. So I'm unmuted here. I can do the thanks, Dennis. There was some claps on the online chat there.
Thanks for attending.
I think we're wrapped there. So it always takes a little while for streams to process the recording. Once that's up there, I'll put it up in the YouTube channel. Dennis, if you can flip me over your deck, I'll post that up in the online resource, and then we'll just put a comment in the event just to let people know that that's there and available. So awesome job. Thanks for talking this month.
Thanks.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone. Bye.